everybody, I'm Kay Spivey. It was suggested to me that I should do some recommendations for poetry books that I enjoy, so I thought I would go ahead and go through. If you're struggling to find an interest in poetry, or if you're just struggling to find some poetry books that you're interested in, here are some recommendations for me. I think if you're just starting to get into poetry, one that many of us start reading at a very early age is, of course, Edgar Allan Poe. Some things that are really great about Poe is that he's very clear in both meter and rhyme, and it's something that you can read done in a fairly masterful way. Sometimes it can get a little sing-songy. Even in Poe's poems, rhyme can become very sing-songy, and really strict meter can feel like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But it's a really good way to get into it. I have the complete collection because it's beautiful. There are other good poets who use strong meter or strong rhyme. Robert Frost is one, of course, who everyone is familiar with, who uses very strong rhyme. But Edgar Allan Poe, I think, was one of my starting points. If you're the type of person who thinks poetry is very hard to understand, hard to get into, you always feel like there's a hidden meaning, something else going on beneath the surface that you're not quite getting, a really good poet to look at is a former poet laureate, Billy Collins. This is one of the collections I have of his. He writes very simply, simple language, simple concepts, very clear concepts. He feels like poetry should be accessible for everyone, and he really stresses this contemporary poetry where your meaning is very clear, your word choice is very accurate and simple. I've heard people say that Billy Collins is sort of cutting corners, that he's not using poetry to its full potential, but I think there's a reason he was poet laureate. He was a very successful poet laureate. He makes poetry very accessible for people. So if you're just looking for someone to kind of push you into an interest in poetry or push you into an interest in contemporary poetry, I highly recommend you look for Billy Collins. So this is Billy Collins, and the title of the poem is An Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Disclaimer before I hold up this book, all of my books are used books, and this one came like this. This book has a big old bite out of the jacket cover. I do leave my jacket covers on my books. The jacket covers are always so beautiful, so this is a phenomenal collection by probably my favorite poet. I adore Rita Dove. She's another poet laureate. This is a really good one to check out. The first poem I ever read by her was Canary, and I was obsessed with it. I hadn't heard of her before, and the poem was just stuck in my head, and I had to go and find out who wrote that poem because it was just so incredible. This is Canary by Rita Dove. Billie Holiday's burned voice had as many shadows as light, a mournful candelabra against a sleek piano, the gardenia, her signature under that ruined face. Now you're cooking, drummer to bass, magic spoon, magic needle, take all day if you have to with your mirror and your bracelet of song. The fact is, the invention of women under siege has been to sharpen love in the service of mystery. If you can't be free, be a mystery. I love that poem. I highly recommend you check out Rita Dove. If you're at all into poetry, you've got to have heard of her by now, and if you haven't, this is a great collection to start with. And if you're just looking for one poem to kind of push you into whether or not you're going to love it, this one's my favorite. Maple Valley Branch Library, 1967. And once you read that, I promise you're going to take the book home with you. Another well-known poet who I highly recommend is Mary Oliver. She writes very nature-oriented poems. As far as, metaphor and, I don't know why I air quote, as far as metaphor and kind of hidden meanings go, she's a good gateway into that. Her poems tend to mean several things or have several things going on in them. They seem to be about one nature-oriented thing, and then they can also discuss many topics, and so I really like the language she uses. Just really beautiful poems. So Mary Oliver is one who I definitely suggest you check out. Another very well-known poet that I like is Jack Gilbert. This is one, I'm going to show you the spine because this cover doesn't have anything. This collection is called The Dance Most of All by Jack Gilbert. This collection is just really beautiful. Another way to get into different types of poetry, I think, especially because the contemporary movement of poetry tends to be fairly confessional. Spoken word poetry is very popular right now. I would recommend anyone trying to get into poetry pick up a copy of Howl by Allen Ginsberg. Regardless of what you think about Allen Ginsberg as a person, Howl did help to define the beatnik movement of poetry. It helped to define a generation of poets. That this was what they were trying to say, and because it was very controversial, there was a big court case about it, it became very prominent. It isn't necessarily the best thing that ever came out of beatnik. I very much enjoy it. I think Allen Ginsberg is a phenomenal writer. But I think this is one that, to help understand what's going on with poetry now, I think Ginsberg was very influential in changing poetry from kind of almost an elitist thing where there were a lot of hidden meanings. It was very, people were trying to hide what they felt into a poem, trying to make it as complicated as possible, and Ginsberg was part of a movement that said, hey, poetry is for everybody, and here's what I'm really feeling. And I feel like that has translated very well with many poets now. I think that was doing in poetry form what rap was also doing. I highly recommend at least read Howl once in your life. Enough with the best known poets and poet laureates and all of that. I want to get into some poets who are maybe not quite as well known, but who I absolutely adore. And the number one poet for me, highly influential poet, every time I read his poetry, my poetry starts to sound like his for a while, and that's Matthew Dickman. And this collection I highly recommend. This is a very contemporary, kind of sexy, maybe an 18 or over collection. But what I like about Matthew Dickman is he uses very dramatic pops of color. The color is very strong and distinct, and the movement is very distinct, and he uses words that sound good together, that maybe the meaning, let me go with Slow Dance, I think, is his best known poem. I'll read the very first part of this one. More than putting another man on the moon, more than a New Year's resolution of yoga and yogurt, we need the opportunity to dance with really exquisite strangers. The use of the man on the moon, yoga and yogurt, it's using alliteration, but it's also tying into the current culture. And exquisite sounds so nice to say. And his poems really focus on that. And at the end, he uses the orange and orangutan slow dance. And I don't know why that pops off the page so well for me. Just the coupling of orange and orangutan, who is a slightly orange monkey, but also the alliteration, the sounds. He uses sound very well throughout his entire collection. And a very accessible poet. This would be another one. If you're trying to get into poetry, you're really not sure, but you're kind of into pop culture, this one will be that bridge for you. The next poet I'm going to recommend is very raw, visceral, especially this collection has to do with watching his wife die of cancer. So this is one that kind of pulls the heartstrings, but this is John Rybicki's We Bed Down into Water. And I was privileged enough to meet John Rybicki. He signed my book, but I'm not going to show you what he wrote. Just really raw, beautiful poems. After reading this collection, I feel like in the moments after reading it, you understand what love is. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. And speaking of kind of raw but very mature poetry, Elizabeth McNamara, I think this is the only self-published collection I have in my stack right here. But Drumbeat for the Mending, this is a very mature collection. It's very heartfelt. I don't know, very surprising, but also just absolutely loved this. And the cover is so beautiful. Who did her cover? Let me look. I don't think it says. At least I can't find it. But this is the most beautiful cover I own. I love that. Whoever painted that, Elizabeth, if you painted that, right on. Like, will you paint my cover for my next book? Because I really love that. It's absolutely gorgeous. And now I'm going to go with my #1 most recommended collection. I always recommend this one. I don't think this is a very well-known poet, but she should be. Lynn Burris Butler. And the collection is Sunday Afternoons with Tolstoy. This is another one that is gonna rip out your heartstrings really masterfully as you read through. I think I sobbed really hard reading through this. This is another one about kind of being with a family member as they're dying. And this one focuses on her and her sister. And it also goes back, she was a teacher, and it goes back to that. This is the poem that I feel kind of sums up the collection. I'm going to go ahead and read it. So this is Lynn Burris Butler's Bad Words. As though Martians had invaded Lincoln School, glowed ultraviolet at night and day, the last and latest thing, an air sanitizer, killed our germs faster than you could say polio or meningitis, not to mention colds, pink eye, ringworm, all the bad things that could happen if you didn't watch your step. Watch out for trick questions, the mystery of multiplication tables, or the spelling words hurled like hard-packed snowballs. Stubborn or divided, or even an easy one like rabbit could trip me up, leave me stunned, reeling, dumb, and banished from the blackboard to the empty rows of desks, the gulag of failure. No solace for a dunce like this, not even art class where the teacher patrols behind us emphasizing color and composition, who snatched my fragile sketches of a house with wisps of smoke drifting from a chimney, tiny lace curtains at the orderly windows, a house wherein a mother makes fudge and sits at the kitchen table singing out words, turning the whole list into a family tune until the Inspector General breaks down the door shouting, "You see? No color. Nothing." Walking home, desperate and suddenly reckless, I take the dare to walk through the culvert that runs under Canal Street. After all, it's safe enough. No flash floods in sight, and the bayonet on my back is only the echo of my own footsteps and the taunts of scaredy cat, a scared little rabbit running straight for the teeth. In a concrete tunnel where somebody has drawn peculiar pictures and painted the word pussy and others I don't know, but clearly words so bad, so unimaginably dangerous, they could be written only underground. I always recommend this collection. I don't know why it's not better known. It's very poignant. Some other poets that I highly recommend that you look into if you're looking into poetry, but I don't own their collections for some reason, is of course Sylvia Plath. She helped define confessional poetry, which is one of the very prominent styles now. Her writing is so beautiful. I would definitely recommend checking her out. Another poet who writes very strongly feminist poems and who helps define a generation of female poets is Adrienne Rich. It's absolutely stunning poetry from Adrienne Rich. So I recommend you check her out. I think I'm gonna stick to those ones for right now to recommend for you. I have a ton of poems lined up behind me, but I have a ton of poetry books, but those ones are some that I highly recommend, especially as you started into poetry, or if you're just looking for something amazing to read. Those are my recommendations. I have a bunch of other collections. I mean, I have full Emily Dickinson. Obviously, I always recommend people check out Emily Dickinson. Her poems are short, but they say a lot in each of them. And I have a complete collection of Maya Angelou. However, this collection is a mystery because, like I said before, I get my collections from used bookstores typically, and this one has all kinds of folded pieces of paper inside, and someone has written down Maya Angelou's poems. It's not my handwriting. I don't know whose handwriting this is, but there's a lot of these in here of the poem written out, and they're not all finished. Some of them are only like partly finished. And then there's also a little pink sticky note. If you're watching this and this is yours, I have your book. You didn't take your notes out of it before you donated it. But I think that's so cool. That's one of the things I absolutely love about getting books secondhand, is that sometimes someone has loved the book quite a bit, or someone loved someone and gave them the book, and there's a tiny reminder of that in it. So I have somebody's well-loved Maya Angelou book, and thank you. And I'm gonna leave it at that for today. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Kay Spivey, and I hope you go and check out some of these poets.